So this is the title and the picture I sent a long time ago. So I think maybe the first part of the title should be called at the end of the chain, and you'll see why at the end of my speech. And also the picture is from the newspaper Nasjon, which is one of the more agricultural newspapers in Norway. It is from a debate, or from the current debate, on resistant microbes, which has been kind of a big part of the Norwegian food safety debate the last years. And you see it in, for instance, Aftenposten, Nasjon, and Dagens Næringsliv are the papers that have fronted these kind of issues, that the microbes or bacteria are striking back. They are becoming resistant to the medicines we use, and so we have no kind of means for treating bacterial infections anymore. Another part of this kind of debate is, of course, that especially the pig and chicken industries are the main culprits in the use of antibiotics, because they use it as growth promoters in addition to as medicine. So I want to go into what I have found to be one of the earliest traces of a critique of the use of antibiotics in Norway. And that is the kind of critique of the use of antibiotics in the salmon farming industry. This is not the first critique, but it's the first fundamental critique, as I'll get into. So I'm going to ask, or reflect on in what way this critique was raised and what problems it brought to the people kind of governing the food safety systems in Norway, which is in a large part the veterinarian profession. I'll also try at the end of the speech to talk a bit about what this might mean for us who tries to write the history of food safety. That would be me and the other project people. So we have to start a bit earlier than the 1980s so I can make kind of a break, so that this controversy I'm going to talk about constitutes a break, so you can see what's the difference after the controversy. So we start in the right after World War II. You see, if you visit the archives of the veterinarian authorities, you will see that it's a major demand for antibiotics in the agricultural sector. During World War II, penicillin had been kind of launched as an antimicrobial drug, and now it was to be used in the agricultural sector. A particular problem that veterinarians struggled with was mastitis, that is an infection of the udder of milking cows. Of course, this had an animal welfare problem. Cows suffered, and it was also an economic problem because you can't sell milk from infected cows. So, if you look at kind of the stories told after the introduction of antibiotics, you always get told that this is a wonder drug or a good weapon against kind of animal disease. That's the way it's framed often. Like, you get antibiotics and then you can handle the microbes, the infections and stuff. But if you look at the archives from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you see a huge struggle with how are we going to organize this new drug. It was a very problematic drug in the beginning. The first problem is the one we see here, the so-called penicillin milk, the danger of the penicillin milk. And that danger was two-sided. Of course, cows being treated with penicillin in this way, where you inject it into the udder to remove kind of the bacteria, leads to cows giving milk that contain antibiotics for a long time. The trouble with that was, of course, that farmers tended to send milk containing antibiotics to dairies. And dairies have very valuable bacterial cultures for making cheese, butter, and all of these things that need bacterial cultures to kind of become the product they make. And antibiotics, penicillin in this case, did not kind of separate friend from foe. They killed the bacterial cultures of the dairies. Another worry from the veterinarians was that a penicillin milk would get through to the consumer. So we ended up drinking milk with antibiotics. This would be a major problem because consumers could potentially or theoretically develop allergies to antibiotics, something that we can imagine would have huge human medical costs. So, the veterinarians had to work, at least for the first 15 years of antibiotics use in animal or kind of animal husbandry, had to work to integrate this new kind of the new medicine. They did this through a range of kind of efforts. First of all, they had major controversies with farmers' unions and so on about who was going to control the prescription of the drug. Was this something that the veterinarian authorities should control, or should it be left more locally? Should it be decided by the central authorities to make a system that was nationwide, or should it be decided by the local district veterinary? And should the farmers be allowed to give antibiotics by themselves? Was also a major question. Another thing they made was they institutionalized regular checkups at dairies that would stop antibiotic milk before it entered the dairy. And also, they had to instructed farmers on holding back milk after treating animals with antibiotics. And they themselves did regular checks on antibiotics. Through this kind of long, and of course this was not as straightforward as I tell it either, because veterinarians were of course fighting with each other on how long should milk be held back, who should control it. So it's a very chaotic period. We try to get familiar with this new medicine. My point is kind of that through this effort of trying to institutionalize or kind of integrate antibiotics, we see a quite special way to conceptualize the travels of our food, the way our food travels from the milking udder and all the way to me as the drinker of the milk, which kind of prevails in the 1960s. The sociologist Eivind Jacobsen at SIFO has written a thesis on kind of different thinking about food safety between veterinarians or food safety experts and ordinary consumers. And it shows very well how veterinarians are almost manically interested in what they call hurdle technologies. Hurdles. You build hurdles so that you imagine the food traveling down a chain, and you build hurdles along that chain so you can stop the unsafe food before it reaches us as the consumer at the end of the chain. And this is actually what seems to be happening during this period between the 40s and 60s. Veterinarians are discussing how they should build the hurdles. What kind of hurdles are the correct ones and stuff. So you can say that the chain is very important, the milk chain in this particular case, but they do it also with meat, they do it with eggs, they do it with everything. Kind of make it into a chain and build hurdles. So, and in this chain, it's a kind of the word the consumer is very important, because this conceptualization of food safety as something that has to do with building hurdles along the chain, you need, what they are protecting is the consumer at the end of the chain. So the consumer is a very important figure in this kind of thinking about food safety. They are not protecting just anybody. They're not protecting kind of people in the hospital, people who are not drinking milk. They are protecting the people drinking milk, the consumer of milk. And this is kind of the field to fork thinking, right? You want to stop the danger from field to fork. In the middle of the 1980s, a Norwegian professor of microbial ecology wrote to the veterinarian journal a letter, and where he attacked the veterinarian thinking about food safety, attacked the way they had been thinking about food safety, and especially the way they had been using antibiotics in the fish farming industry. The fish farming industry at this time was, of course, booming. The middle of the 1980s was the kind of big period of optimism, but also a period of major problems, because the salmon, this kind of new creature being domesticated into this new industry, got sick. He didn't handle this kind of introduction into farming very well. One example is the Hitra disease, which started just outside the coast here and spread towards the country, but a whole lot of diseases coming from fungi, parasites, bacteria, and viruses. And the bacterial infections were kind of the major problem. The 1980s then was both a time of huge optimism on the behalf of fish farming, but also a time of deep, very kind of critical voices coming to the fore because of a huge amount of antibiotics being consumed in this industry. The veterinarians were hardly able to handle all of the disease problems coming up and a whole new sector coming in under their responsibility. So one of them said, "We are drowning in a shitload of fish." So kind of their whole system was upset by this wave of fish suddenly showing up at the coast. And this Tore Midtvedt was the name of the professor in microbial ecology writing his critique of the veterinarians. He was an expert on resistance in bacteria and also hospital hygiene, how to handle resistant bacteria in hospitals. So his expertise was a completely different field, but he was an expert on the microbe, its evolution, its ecology, its kind of complex relation. And he was in several articles, he attacked the vets for the liberal use of antibiotics. He's estimated that they used more, in 1985, they used more than 200 million human doses of antibiotics on salmon. That was more than the whole of the rest of the agricultural sector and human medicine taken together in the year of 1985 in Norway. So he claimed that the liberal use of antibiotics would speed up the tendency to kind of the evolution of the microbes, making them resistant. He saw it as a real danger that antibiotics would no longer be a functioning drug if this continued. And he called it, what I write in the headline here, he said that, and I'm quoting now, that what we were seeing was no less than a pollution of the microcosm at a macro scale. All experience shows us that as the rational creature they are, the microbes will develop resistance, and we must expect that they will strike back. And he challenged and said that this is not a veterinarian problem anymore. This is not a problem reserved for the veterinarians, as it might become a threat to human health, even in medical hospitals where kind of the patients don't even consume this fish. So it challenges the notion of the consumer, the idea that the veterinarians held on that you are protecting a consumer at the end of the chain. He said that's not the problem anymore. The problem is much bigger. So what Midtvedt is doing in these articles, he's challenging the veterinarians kind of thinking about this food chain. And that at the end of the chain, what you need to protect is the consumer. So he's kind of challenging some very basic assumptions in the system built up. He claimed that it was necessary to think in much bigger contexts than the chain concepts allowed. Resistant microbes in salmon could be picked up by birds, people fishing, or by me eating my lunch at the bench, having bird droppings, carrying resistant microbes. Because the pens around, or the salmon pens around those, were kind of birds eating other sea fish that also would get the antibiotic drugs in themselves. So the kind of E. coli, salmonella, and all of these microbes around the pens could be carried anywhere. There were no kind of possibility to limit the spread of this, he claimed. So he claimed that this kind of chain from ocean to fork or to our tables needed to be widened. And of course the veterinarians reacted, and it's very strange to see how they react in saying that they have good control on fish not reaching the consumer being, so the fish is not a threat to the consumer, so they really don't talk to each other at all in this debate. My point here today is not kind of to follow this controversy through all the way, but rather to kind of think about Midtvedt's critique and of this food chain concept, what it might mean in a larger context. For today, we know the debates I mentioned that's been running both in the World Health Organization and the Norwegian food safety authorities, and the Norwegian government just recently launched a report dealing with microbial resistance. This figure is actually from that report. This is what the food chain might look like if you take the microbial perspective. It's not very much like a chain anymore. And how do you kind of delimit this in order to control? How would a hurdle technology really work in this conceptualization of it? So I claim that Midtvedt is one of the first people in Norway, and that is kind of well established. He's one of the gurus of this kind of thinking, that he launches the first critique that reminds us somehow about the present situation. And the post-antibiotic era is a word that's used by the World Health Organization and also the Norwegian health authorities. And it's very unclear what this might mean, because it's usually described as a future where resistant microbes destroys all the progress of modern medicine. Even kind of very basic diseases like urinary tract infections or mastitis will be impossible to treat if you don't have antibiotics anymore. That's kind of the storyline going through this. So it's kind of a term that is to mobilize somehow, both politically and scientifically, I think. The Norwegian report that I mentioned that was just recently launched is written, and the people involved in writing this report is also quite interesting. It's written by a group of experts from the medical sector, the human medical sector, public health, veterinary medicine, and the food safety authorities. And they state that microbial resistance need to be seen in a one health perspective. And this is a thing that's been happening since the 70s, but now is gaining some momentum, thinking about animal health, human health, and ecosystem health, or environment in one kind of together, integrated medicine somehow. So we need to, the report claimed that we need to get a more integrated strategy for getting an overview of the problem of microbial resistance, and we need to reorganize many of the kind of divisions of labor we have within the food sector, within the health sector, and the environmental sector. So when Tore Midtvedt in the 1980s criticized the use of antibiotics in fish farming, he challenged the veterinarian food chain in a way that seems to be very present right now. And it's, of course, not necessarily a direct link here, but at least it's a conceptual link between his thinking and what seems to be prevailing now. Okay, now I do a switch that might seem a bit strange. This is one of the kind of books that historians of technology, especially, but also some historians of food write. So we write books about the food chain. I also did it in my PhD thesis about the building of a frozen food chain. How do frozen food get from ocean to table in Norway, using the freezer as the point of departure? And if you look at, this is one of the books. It's edited by Warren Belasco and Roger Horowitz, two quite kind of well-renowned scholars in the food studies field and also the history of technology. And it's very typical in its organization of the chapters. First, you have overview, the theoretical concepts. How do you think the food chain? Then you have a part about animals, processing, distribution, sales, and consumption. So you actually trace the chain in the book. So the food chain for the historian is a narrative concept, the concept that we use to structure our narratives. It's a structuring tool. But it's also somehow, it's also a pedagogical tool or a moral tool, because as we normally state, or often state, you find this statement almost everywhere, The consumers no longer know where their food come from. So by telling these chain stories, you can kind of show people and learn people where our food really comes from. What's the origin of the food in the industrialized chain? And these books always usually ends on the consumer. So the consumer is always at the end, never or at the beginning of the chain or something like that. It's very common. So this kind of food chain concept seems to be a very intuitive concept, and it's very good for telling stories with, because it all makes sense to all of us, I think. Thinking about food as something that travels from one place to another. It's a geographical term as well. So it kind of places the food. Let's see. So, my little feeling with this might be that the concept also is pretty problematic. This kind of literature is often very technology focused. It focuses on the technologies. Another kind of food studies focus on identities. I think we've seen the split quite well here today. That some people talk about identities and some people talk about the political economy of food or the kind of institutions or the technologies. And the food chain gang is kind of the last gang. The problem with this is that you don't necessarily question the concept, the food chain. And this always irritates me when I read my own thesis. Everyone knows it's embarrassing to go back and read what you've already written. But it irritates me because I see that this chain is not a concept that's used like before the World War, for instance. They don't think about freezing technologies in the same way, in the chain way that they do after. So it's actually a conceptual. The concept has a very long history itself, of course, and by opening it up, we might kind of find some other kind of stories. So now I go back briefly to, it might be that this is from an advertisement for antibiotics. It's really misplaced because it was in a veterinary journal at the same time as you discussed the global environmental consequences of antibiotics, and this company portrayed their drug in this way. So kind of the antibiotic udder has gone global. Anyway, the challenge that Midtvedt and this post-antibiotic era might raise might also, if you think about it as a historian or a cultural studies guy, also be a conceptual challenge to the way we organize our thinking about the food we eat. So it's more like the microbes now don't kind of follow the logics we have built up around when we think about our foods, and how do we do it? This is both a challenge to the veterinarians, of course, but insofar as historians are kind of also telling stories about food, it would be, I think, important for us to write this out not just as a technical or medical challenge and so on, but also a cultural, conceptual challenge that we need to rethink the way we think about our food's travels. Yeah. So, how could thinking about kind of playing with the notions of where the chain goes, maybe the consumer or is no longer that important figure, maybe it's the human, as all of us, that are now kind of firmly placed in the pigsty, and we are not longer at the end of the chain. That seems to be a very big part of Midtvedt's critique, right? Even people having surgery in hospitals are affected by what happens to the animals at the farm or in the aquaculture business. So it's kind of placing the animal in the pigsty, but also asking or reopening the question what it might mean to eat well and safe, kind of after the microbial counter-strike. Seems to be one of the challenges in the food safety field, but also for us that are writing about food. That's what I had. This is research in the making, so it's not finished. Thank you.